Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I see we've got people from all over the world, really. Romania, Texas, a lot of Nevada folks on the line today. Thank you all for joining us. We'll give it another minute or so for people to log in, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, hello, everyone. We are so excited to welcome you to the next webinar in our People Fundamentals series, Doing the Work, How HR Can Lead the Way on DEI. My name is Myra Rivera, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. All attendees are in view-only mode. Please submit any questions for our presenters in the Ask a Question box below the slide screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and the speakers will address them during the Q&A portion of the event. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive the recording post-event. The slides are already linked in the related content section below. Please also notice that the clipboard icon on the far right of the doc, that is our feedback survey. If you could take a moment to complete the survey before leaving the platform, we'd greatly appreciate it. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our host speaker, Susan Van Klink, Strategic Advisor at Betterworks. Sue, over to you.
Thanks, Myra. Super excited to be here today, and thanks for everyone who's joining us from all over. And a special thanks to the Canadians who have joined the webinar today. Joining you myself just north of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'm very excited to be speaking with Dr. Stephanie Creary today. Dr. Creary is an identity and diversity scholar, a field researcher, and an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School of Business of the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on understanding how to create more inclusive and equitable workplaces and organizations through positive relational practices, and she's going to speak with us about that today. Dr. Creary also recently wrote the article, How to Elevate Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Work in Your Organization, which is fascinating. If you haven't read it already, we will be sending out a link to it and other materials that Dr. Creary has made available for your understanding. She tells me that, sort of later on today, she'll be flying off to France for I believe, a conference, and then spending Christmas and New Year's in Hawaii, which I'm extremely envious about. So we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Creary here today. Before Stephanie starts to talk a little bit about her subject, I'm going to share with you a little bit about myself and about the People Fundamentals series brought to you by Betterworks. I'm a strategic advisor. I work with Betterworks and other software companies on how to bring best practice software to market. I help executives both in their careers and in their businesses to elevate and achieve greater results. And I speak on a host of topics, of which the nearest and dearest to my heart is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which I think we've made lots of strides, but we have a long way to go. I've been doing this for a long, long time, and I'm super excited for this particular conversation with Dr. Creary, just in terms of the wealth of information that she brings on how to move the needle, which is what I continue to hear people asking about and really, sort of struggling for best practices. And I think you'll get a lot of that today. So if we talk about the People Fundamental series, it's a monthly webinar series that Betterworks has created that features thought leaders who are experts in performance management, employee engagement, diversity, equity, inclusion, and more. And the goal really is to bring thought-provoking topics to our audience, creating meaningful dialogue and leaving attendees with actionable insights that you can implement right away. So that's really the purpose of the People Fundamentals series. And as I said, it's sponsored by Betterworks. And Betterworks' goal is really to meet people where they work to improve the experience of work through modern performance management. Organizations rely on Betterworks to increase employee engagement, manager support, and effectiveness and business impact. And we're going to talk later in the presentation about how great HR technology tools can really help underpin some of these DEI strategies that we're going to be talking about. I'm very excited to have all of you join us for what I hope is going to be a dynamic conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Creary to kick us off. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you all for being here. I got really excited looking at this chat, seeing where you all were from. Certainly shout out to my friends in the Philly area. I would have to say that this is the most number of people from the state of Nevada that I've ever experienced during one of these webinars. So I don't know if you all are from the same company, but great to have the Nevada representation, Las Vegas, Reno, and Logandale. And I also saw someone from Wichita. I lived in Wichita for about 4 months, about 18 years ago. So thank you all for joining us, not only from all over the United States, but there's certainly people dialing in from around the world. I saw Romania and the UK there. As much as possible for our conversation today, I'd like to think that my work and the insights that I'm sharing with you today are global in nature, meaning I believe that they do represent research that is that can be used and consumed in many different countries around the world. And certainly, if you do have more specific questions around that during the Q&A portion, you can certainly we can certainly address those there. But at any point in time, if you do have any thoughts, feel free to include that in the Q&A, and Sue and I will we'll make sure to address them. So without further ado, I'd like to kick us off by starting off with two polls. We have a number, hundreds actually, of people who are here on this call today. And I think one way to stimulate engagement, and I think also to center us in our conversation today, is to just see where you all are at this point. So let's start with a question that I'm sure you're used to answering quite frequently, your position, your relative position in your company. And so pick the one that you feel that best describes your position. Would you identify as a senior leader, a middle or a line manager, a DEI leader, or some other people HR leader, not DEI, not in a DEI specific role? Now, I fully acknowledge that many of you have multiple roles, but just for the sake of simplicity, pick the one that you feel most identified with. So we'll go ahead and thank you. We already have about 20% of people. We actually have now 748 people on this call, which is very exciting. Thank you all again for joining us.
And Dr. Creary, maybe just to remind people to put their answers in on the poll versus in the chat. So
yes.
Come up online.
Yeah, you should see a poll. You should see a polling feature, and that's where you want to put your answer there. So thank you so much for noticing that. King of Prussia. Hello, King of Prussia. I always escaped out to King of Prussia during the height of the pandemic to just get some air. I live right in the center of Philly, down the street from the University of Pennsylvania. So it's amazing how you just travel 30 minutes outside of Philly. It's open and it's wide and it's spacious. So when we were all feeling a bit claustrophobic, stuck inside, King of Prussia was one of my favorite places to go to. All right, let's take about another 15 seconds or so to try to get some more people, and then we'll go ahead and show the poll.
And I see people asking where to find the slides. There is a slide window. You want to make sure that you have that maximized. And so look for the slide window. You might need to choose it from the 3 bars on the top right. In order to have it show up for you. You'll see us in one screen and the slides in the other, and that's where the poll questions are.
All right, excellent. So I'll just give it a little bit more time since some people are still trying to figure out this fantastic platform. I had the chance to look at it from the audience side last week, and I think it's fabulous. I do so many of these webinar presentations, so I'm constantly learning new technologies, and I really do love this platform. All right, so let's see what you said. Okay, yes, so 58.4% of you are people, HR leaders, non-DEI, and then the remaining of you are split almost evenly between senior leaders, middle line managers, and DEI leaders. Fantastic. Okay, we have one more polling question for those who didn't get the chance to participate in this, who are just now figuring out where to indicate your choices. The second one is for us to get a bit of a sense of how you would characterize your DEI experience. Do you feel that you are an experienced champion? So an experienced champion is somebody who's been doing this work for a while and is always sending what I like to refer to as green signals, meaning go signals when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. Then we have engaged newcomers who also send relative green signals, go signals when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. But you're new. You would just say, you're rather new to this, and that's how you would describe, but that doesn't mean that you're not excited. It just means that you feel that you have a lot still to learn. I think we all have a lot still to learn, but you might really feel like you have a lot still to learn. Then we have reluctant beginners. We can consider people who are in the reluctant beginners categories. I often, when I think about a traffic light, I often think of these people as maybe yellow or maybe passing between yellow and red, meaning that, this is something that is new for you, and you have some reluctance to jump into DEI activities because you might see that there are also cons or downsides to this work. And then resistant beginners, I would characterize as people who send mostly red signals. You're maybe here because somebody's making you be here, but you're here, we're happy you're here, and we're hoping that with all that we have to share with you today, it will at least keep you motivated to continuing to attend workshops and seminars like these. All right, let's take about another 15 seconds for everyone to indicate their choice. Great. All right, going once, going twice. All right, wonderful. All right, so we have wonderful, lots of new people here. That's fantastic. It's always great when we have experienced champions. Here representing 19% of our attendees who responded. 70% engaged newcomers, 10.3% reluctant beginner, and 0.2% resistant beginners. And thank you, that there are a lot of beginners here, whether you're engaged or reluctant or resistant. Always so happy to have you in the audience. I feel that the best thing you can always do for yourself and your organization, the people on your team, is just try to learn more, right? And it's through learning more that I think we can develop more skills and competencies. And I would say energy around this work. DEI work is hard. It takes a long time to make progress, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And hopefully the tools and resources we have to share with you today will move some of you who are maybe in the yellow or the red zone, from red to perhaps orange, and from yellow to perhaps lime green, as we begin to think about how much information is powerful in this day and age, and is certainly a conduit through which many of us can be better and more effective in our various roles. Okay, so I want to kick us off with some of the insights that I have to share with you today by talking about definitely DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion work. And I want to differentiate the idea that many of us do, and many of our organizations do, lots of kinds of DEI work, right? And there are various people doing DEI work. There are chief diversity officers doing this work, and diversity councils and employee resource groups. There are HR leaders. There are frontline employees. There are middle managers. There are lots of people doing things that we would consider DEI work. And this work can include things like diversity training, whether you're participating or leading it, diversity recruiting, mentoring and sponsorship, participating in business or ERG groups, creating policies, reinforcing policies. So there's any number of things that we could be doing in our roles that would be largely characterized as DEI work. But there's a difference between doing these activities and actually valuing these activities when they are done. So many of us do them because we have to do them. Many of us do them because we're passionate about doing them. But that doesn't mean that we always, as individuals, as a part of a team, as leaders, as organizations, show that this work is valuable. And as we begin to think about valuing DEI work, let's think about this idea that in order for this work, just like any task that we have as marketers, as HR leaders, as professors, these jobs cannot be done effectively. This work cannot be done effectively unless there is adequate staffing, adequate human resources, adequate financial resources, and that the people doing the work have the power and the authority to drive change. Now, a lot of what I'm sharing with you here, we can take out the acronym DEI and just call this valuing work. And so no matter what our work tasks are throughout the day, if we're the person who is charged with leading the latest PR campaign or rolling out the latest employee initiatives focused on, benefits and so forth, all of these ideas are really important to us as individuals in our workplaces. We want to feel like we're adequately staffed. We want to feel like we have adequate financial resources. We want to feel like our work makes an impact and that we have the power and the authority to drive any change that is for the better, not only of our own livelihood in our organizations, but for our organization. And so what I'm trying to convey to you is that whether we're talking about this as DEI work or other types of work, many of these principles still hold true. And this idea that employees at all levels committed to engage in doing the work is important for any type of work that we do in our organization, including DEI work. And, I identify myself as a diversity, equity, and inclusion scholar, but my broader field of study is organizational behavior. And so I can tell you that research says, regardless of whether we're talking about DEI work or other work tasks, this idea of feeling that your work is valued and feeling that your organization values your work is really important for people's willingness to actually do the work, okay? So when we think about DEI work specifically, though, I wanted to highlight for you some of the specific challenges that might exist engaging managers, line managers, middle managers, and more senior leaders in this work. And so it's important to note that middle managers and senior leaders are not engaged in DEI work in the same ways. And what I mean by that is senior leaders often engage in DEI work because they understand it as it relates to business strategy and market share. So there's a business case that they understand, and as the purveyors of and the foremost leaders who are charged with making sure that the organization stays competitive and grows, business leaders often come into the DEI conversation convinced that the work needs to be done because there is a solid business case. But for people who are in the middle of the organization, who are line managers or middle managers, the idea of making the company grow more effectively over time is a bit too abstract and far removed from their day-to-day experience. So for middle managers, engaging them in DEI work is really about helping them to understand how doing this work, how valuing this work makes their day-to-day jobs and tasks better. And so I always like to think about that as the team level. How does DEI work going to make my team perform more effectively? How is it going to make my team members happier and be more engaged in their work? So in addition to knowing that there are differences between engaging senior leaders and middle managers in DEI work, it's also important to know that accountability for DEI work is also experienced differently when we separate these two levels of leadership. Senior leaders often feel more accountable to DEI work when it is tied to financial incentives. We know that in many companies, senior leaders' bonus compensation is tied in some part to the ability to accomplish a variety of DEI goals, not just headcount, not just representation of people in leadership roles, but also with respect to education and training and participating in a variety of activities that support the broader overarching DEI strategy. For middle managers, though, I would say it's not as a common practice in many organizations I study or work with to tie their work to financial incentives. Increasingly so, organizations are tying middle managers' performance to the execution of DEI roles, knowing that performance evaluations are often used to determine promotions and important career opportunities. And so when we think about middle managers and tying their accomplishment of DEI goals to some aspect of their evaluation, one of the things that becomes really interesting from the middle manager's perspective is the questions that they will have around equity. If it's the case that I'm being asked to do this work, is it going to be valued as much as my other work? And if it's not seen as valued, if I as a middle manager am not held accountable to doing this work, like the other tasks I have assigned, it becomes deprioritized, which is what I've found often in my research. And many of you probably have found this in your organizations as well. And so this merit framework that I'm going to introduce you to in just a few moments is designed to help us think about how do we engage middle managers and senior leaders, whether you are in HR or not. How do we engage them more in doing this work? And this idea of HR leading the way when it comes to DEI is really a function of also understanding HR's place in this broader conversation. And I would say, as we think about middle managers and we think about senior leaders, I think we can also think about HR leaders as being those who are in the middle ranks of their organization, but also HR leaders who are in much more senior positions. And so when we think about the idea of merit, there's a whole body of research on meritocracy, merit-based rewards, what that means. So I'm going to tell you what it means, and then I'm going to also help you to understand how it's experienced in organizations. And so the idea of merit means that, to be fair, rewards are distributed based on people's actual contributions, their actual efforts. And that if we're really engaging in merit-based practices, we're acknowledging that there's equal rewards for equal work. And we often hear this when we talk about pay equity, but this idea of merit-based rewards and pay equity would be, if I do the same job as the next person, we should be getting paid relatively similarly. And so this idea of merit is actually assuming that awards and efforts and rewards can actually be codified. And by that, I mean that we can measure these things systematically across groups of people. Now, in practice, what I'm seeing in my research and what many organizations are experiencing is that we often determine some types of work as being much more worthy of merit than other types of work. And so what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is certain work subjectively feels that it's inherently more valuable and worthy of being rewarded than other types of work. And in this case, in many of our organizations, DEI work is not often positioned as equally valuable as some of the other tasks that we have. And that's not just by us as individuals, it's often by our organizations. And so then you ask me, Stephanie, so what are the consequences? Well, the consequences of that is people are not going to do it. If it's not treated as comparable to or valued or rated as high of a priority as my other tasks, then I'm not going to engage in the DEI work. And then DEI work is not going to be perceived as merit worthy. The downsides to all this is we know that DEI work is real work and it takes a lot of work. And so what would it look like after this call if many more of us were champions for making sure that when people do DEI work, they are rewarded for it, just like they are rewarded for their other work tasks? So that's my primary thesis, and I'm going to unpack this merit framework for you as we go along. So each letter in the word merit stands for what I think is an important principle as we're thinking about engaging more leaders and managers in DEI work and really valuing this work that we need people and we want people in our organizations to do. So M stands for make DEI goals and work actionable, measurable, and evidence-based. Now, it probably isn't surprising to you that as a professor who's a social scientist, that I am going to talk about actions and measurement and evidence-based. And I would say it's so important because DEI work does not have to be abstract. It does not have to be fuzzy, as long as we think very specifically about what are the goals that we want people to accomplish. And again, there are a variety of goals. In many organizations, they always start with representation goals, and that's fine. Many of our organizations are subject to federal laws in our respective countries around making sure that we are accounting for the representation of different groups. So it goes without saying that that's always the first place where many companies start. But there are many inputs to changing representation that should also be measured. In many cases, many of our organizations conduct annual inclusion or culture engagement surveys. Those have numbers attached to them. They have scores. And so what would it look like to establish goals around what the inclusion score should be next year when the survey is run again? And then certainly I'm talking about annual goals. We could also have quarterly goals as well. The point here is that DEI work needs to be concrete and practical and measurable if we want people to engage in it. Now, I always talk about evidence-based. So in so many cases, I think many of us have really bright ideas for what we should be doing tactically in our organizations in order to achieve goals. And so, for example, we might decide, let's have a speaker series, right? Because we believe that that speaker series is going to help drive people's sense of engagement in this company. And so it becomes evidence-based. The speaker series becomes evidence-based once we actually look to see if people's engagement changed as a result of participating in a speaker series. And so that becomes really important. It's not just to put activities out there to develop and implement them, but to go back and to measure to see if they're actually having the desired effect on our culture or whatever other outcomes we're trying to measure. And so what would this look like from a roles and responsibilities perspective? Well, if you're a CEO or a senior leader in some capacity, this means that you have to set these goals and that these goals can focus on a variety of workplace culture outcomes, such as the ones I've already mentioned: inclusion, engagement, belonging, and et cetera. For mid-level managers, who don't often set the goals at the organizational level, what mid-level managers can do is actually take these broader organizational goals and set them for the team level. And what would it look like to begin to capture inclusion, engagement, and belonging and share that progress with the team throughout the year or quarterly, if that makes more sense. E stands for elevate, DEI work internally and externally. So DEI work is often considered invisible work. And when something is invisible, as many of you know, people don't recognize it as being important. And so in order to engage more people in doing this work, particularly at the management and the leadership level, elevating this work by making it visible internally and externally becomes really important. When people can see that it's being done and they can see progress that's being made, even if it's small progress, then it becomes a reinforcement strategy. And so elevating it would also take making sure that there's the appropriate budget and the resources to do the work that then needs to be made visible. From the perspective of senior leaders and CEOs, this might mean making sure that the CEO is not just getting a report out on how the DEI efforts are going, but is fundamentally involved in helping to set the strategy and helping to maintain accountability amongst his, her, or their senior leadership team. And then that also means, as we're thinking about budgeting and resources, to begin to understand what that looks like. People always ask me, how much money should a company have in order to drive effective DEI engagement strategy? And that's such a complicated question because it depends, right? It depends on like what types of activities are you engaging in? How big is your organization, right? How much are you willing to spend? But what I usually say is it's probably more than you think it is, right? It's probably way more money than you think it is. And so market comparisons often become really important. And I think this is where I love engaging with the broader HR and DEI communities. I've engaged with these two communities in a variety of different consortia, and they often openly, willingly share their not only tactics around how to increase their budget and their spend on this work, but they often share with peers what size budget that they have for this work. And so that's often how the market comparison information is received. Mid-level managers developing team-level DEI initiatives, such as training for your team members related to DEI, sharing stories about your experiences with DEI, and then when we think outside of the personal, when we think about DEI as something that's important for enhancing team creativity and team performance and team innovation, creating team-level DEI initiatives that are focused on making the ideation process, the process of creating new ideas for the team, a more effective diversity initiative is something that's really important. And then with respect to mid-level managers, encouraging mid-level managers to report out their DEI work in their performance review processes. So when we're talking about how much your team had accomplished in the widgets and whatever services you've provided, to say, here's all the DEI work that I have done this year, and putting that in the performance review process becomes important as well. With respect to R is require leaders and managers to participate in behavior-based DEI trainings. And so what I mean by behavior-based DEI trainings, I mean DEI trainings that are focused on changing behavior. Now, largely today's seminar that you all are participating in can be considered a DEI training. It is part awareness building, but also part behavior-based. It's part behavior-based because we're not actually asking you to demonstrate a behavior during the course of the training, but what I'm sharing with you are tactics that you can use that behaviorally might be different from those that you're already engaging in. And so more trainings where people are taught, not only told what they should do, which is what we're doing here today, but people actually are expected to show that they are doing these things and to demonstrate competency in these behaviors. Those are more effective in driving change in organizations than trainings that are just focused on knowledge. But it goes without saying, I always tell people as a professor, people can't learn the behaviors that they need to engage in unless you actually give them the knowledge and build their awareness on the topic first. So it's not that we shouldn't be building people's awareness at all. It's that we also need to tack onto our awareness building efforts concrete ideas of the behaviors that we want to see different as a result of the training. And so CEOs and senior leaders should require leaders and managers to attend these behavior-based trainings that are focused on core managerial activities. So these are behavior-based trainings focused on hiring practices, giving effective and constructive feedback, and engaging in equitable and non-biased performance management practices, and engaging in effective mentoring and sponsorship programs. And so there's a lot, these are just some activities and ideas to get you started. There's a whole list of other things we can talk about, but I think that should at least center you on what I mean by what would be some effective training topics. Mid-level managers should attend these trainings, but it also becomes important to, when you attend a training like the one that you all are attending here today, share this with someone else. You will get access to the slides. I would invite you to share these, not necessarily broadly on the internet, right? But certainly with somebody in your organization who might benefit from this information, because that might motivate them to continue to seek out webinars like this externally, but also internal DEI learning to help improve their ability to be effective in doing this work. I stands for identify leaders and non-managerial employees willing to serve as DEI sponsors. I work with hundreds of students, undergraduate and MBA students every day. And these students are so passionate about DEI work, and they are just waiting for an opportunity to contribute to the DEI strategy in your organization. But it's often not clear what the pathway is for their contributions. And so some companies that I have studied have created what they call ambassador or champion programs for non-managerial employees who are, between 0 and 5 years out of school, who want to contribute to their organization's DEI work. And oftentimes that's translating big abstract initiatives into team level initiatives. And so beginning to identify other people, especially those who are not typically charged with this work, becomes really important for implementing these DEI goals. Senior leaders and CEO, these at this level, being a champion becomes really important. Sending green signals is really important. And so that means engaging and participating in DEI councils, sponsoring employee resource groups, and participating in formal sponsorship programs. Mid-level managers, this can include implementing this ambassador program at your team level. And last but not least, one of my favorite parts of this framework is the team. Treating DEI work as core work and not peripheral work, otherwise known as DEI work is not a side hustle to our real jobs. And the more that we treat this DEI work as core and as part of our activity in our jobs, the more that people will be willing to do this work. And so that means if we are doing DEI work, our titles and our reporting relationships need to reflect that this work is important. It needs to be included in our performance management processes. And so at the senior leader level, CEO level, that means that this might mean that in your organization, having the DEI leader report as part of the C-suite, that sends the signals that this DEI work is a senior leader responsibility. And then certainly at the mid-level manager, making sure that their performance evaluation includes DEI as a core competency, and their ability to engage team members and develop their team members' DEI competencies as a core competency is something that's really important as well. So with that said, I'm going to say thanks for listening, and I'm going to open it up with Sue, turn it back to Sue, where we can sort of have some time to engage in dialogue. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Stephanie. We've got lots of questions pouring in, so there will be lots to talk about over the next 20 minutes or so. I want to first make a comment, which I love that your framework is called the MERIT framework. I think there are a lot of people that have a concern, spoken or unspoken, that DEI work is potentially not merit-based, and that, people will get ahead even if they're not qualified. And I think calling it merit really subliminally, installs this idea that this is really about helping people have a level playing field, helping people to understand how to create an inclusive environment, a diverse environment for everyone, where everyone feels they belong. So I love the framework. And I really, one of the questions that came up, or there were a lot of questions in the chat about top down versus bottom up, and what to do when maybe your organization isn't completely bought in from the top down. Any suggestions there about how to make merit work from, start where you are basically and go from there?
Yeah. So one of the assumptions behind my merit-based framework is that most DEI initiatives didn't start from the top down. And so what the merit framework is trying to do is to now patch that gap in most companies' DEI activities. So in fact, in many companies today, DEI activities have started, whether we're talking about the veteran companies where they've been doing this work for 30 years, or many of the new companies who just entered this space in the last 3 years. It's often started with individual contributors convening and then forming something that looked like an early stage employee resource group, or actually was a formal employee resource group. So these initiatives often start bottom up. And what happens is, in many cases, there's a variety of individual contributors who then convince someone who is in senior leadership. Oftentimes, it is a person who is from a historically marginalized group. Not that has to be the case, but that just seems to have been the history in many organizations. And that person, who is often more senior, then everyone else who is part of that early coalition helps to champion this DEI work. So many companies reach out to me now. I have a company that I'll be speaking to next week, and it is literally a group of 5 employees who've helped to form a Black employee resource group. It's not formal with all the structures that some companies have, but informally, and they've given themselves a name. And the person who was the sponsor is the one Black senior executive who's been at the company for 20 years. And so we've been having this conversation around what can he do next. And so what he's learned is his job is to start recruit his peers who are also senior leaders to support not just the initiatives for the Black employees, but to understand that while it might have started with this specific group's initiatives or needs, how do we begin to think about this as a broader strategy? So I have found that to be a quite common origin story for many companies' DEI initiatives, and that has led to now these top-down, rightfully so, initiatives that are focused on finances, strategy, structure, processes, and metrics.
That's great. And I know there were questions about ERGs as well, how to get one started, how to support the people that are doing the emotional work of diversity, equity, and belonging through the ERG groups. I think that's really important. One of the things you mentioned in your merit-based approach a lot is bringing managers into the fold, that there's a lot of grassroots efforts and there's a lot of senior leader efforts, but how can the manager do a better job at being part of the solution to how we bring this more front and center in our everyday work lives? Could you just expand on that a little bit more, Dr. Creary?
Absolutely. So if I talked about the fact that the origins in many companies is a sort of grassroots initiative and the one senior leader, and then it moves to senior leadership, what we have is the missing middle in many companies today. And the middle is often missing because companies haven't created initiatives for them. We've been thinking about tops and bottoms and not thinking about the middle of the organization. And so for some of the veteran companies that in the 1990s formulated employee resource groups, and in early 2000s, they really made it a top-down strategy. Where they are today, 15 years after senior leadership bought in, and I'm not suggesting that should take this long, by the way, but where they are today, 15 years after senior leadership brought in, is trying to create a cadre of initiatives focused on middle manager engagement. And so this is actually where most of my work has been for the last 5 years. There is a report that we are going to share with you. Make sure you have access to that link. And this is a project that I started in 2018 with my colleagues at Wharton, and it's focused on improving workplace culture through evidence-based diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. And one of the whole motivations for this larger research report was helping to imbue middle managers with the specific tactical information that they needed to have in order to effectively drive DEI change at their team level. So if you read this report, it's also housed on Wharton's diversity website. It's actually not meant to be read cover to cover. It's very long. It's about 60 pages. It's a great resource guide. But at the beginning of the report is a table of contents, and it has about 12 different sections in it. And for example, if you turn to the table of contents, you would see, for example, belonging as a section header. And what that means is if you go to that section, it's going to tell you how you as a middle manager should be thinking about belonging and what you can do tactically as a middle manager to help create the sense of belonging on your team. What's important is that we didn't make this stuff up. What we did is we ran a number of surveys in a variety of companies, and we measured the relationship between the tactic or the practice and the outcome on belonging, broadly trying to understand what drives belonging in amongst the companies we studied. And so the importance of not understanding that, as part of belonging is driven by having managers who are effectively engaged in DEI work and valuing that on the team, we said, okay, so if managers are important, what then should managers be doing? The caveat here is I have shared this report with senior leaders in organizations, and they've said to me, I know you wrote this report, Stephanie, for middle managers, but I actually think senior leaders should be doing this work as well. So I invite you to check out that report. It is very extensive. We've publicized it a lot. I've actually shared it with a lot of companies. I now usually take out pieces of the report when I do trainings so I can show people the evidence behind what I'm about to teach them to do. But I hope it's free, right? Because that's a wonderful thing with working with the university is somebody else paid for it. But it's free resource guide to anyone who's interested in learning more about what they can do. And I just encourage people to take the tactics that are in there and share those with people. I'm not saying all of them that are in there, because there's hundreds of things, but even like pick 5 and send those out and say, have you tried this today? I think that's the work that really needs to be done for many companies that have been actively working on a bottom-up strategy and a top-down strategy, or finding that they haven't yet engaged the middle of the organization.
Well, and for a lot of people that were asking the question, what do we do if we're stuck? Is something better than nothing? Sort of how can we get started? I think that answer is a fantastic answer for a lot of questions that are coming up in the chat. And the Betterworks team will make that report available as part of the follow-up to this fundamentals webinar program. And so we're excited about that. I also would answer a question that's been coming up in the chat a lot, which is, how do you incorporate some of these things into performance management best practices? And how do you, sort of hold managers accountable to doing this type of work? And one of the answers I would provide, and part of the reason why I'm at Betterworks as a DEI leader, is that I do believe we need technologies and tools to help sort of hold people accountable, create visibility, make sure that you can see that developmental conversations are happening, that objectives and goals, OKRs, are happening as it relates to DEI work, and that you're evaluating, sort of that people are actually moving the needle. There's also engagement surveys that can be DEI in flavor and so on. So there's lots of things you can do from a technology perspective that helps to, sort of get visibility, hold people accountable, and reinforce to people that this is an area that they should actually be focused on, and help them to be better at doing it. Anything I missed there, Dr. Creary, in terms of things you would recommend on how to operationalize this, or how to make this really, sort of take roots in an organization?
Yeah, I would just say, in the abstract, what I hear you saying, what I hear everyone saying is, how do we actually get people to do anything in the workplace, right? We have goals for them. We ask them to report on their progress, and we let them know when they have to improve, right? That's the basic of how work, what basis of how work is done. And DEI work is no different. I know that as a professor, there are a certain number of papers and activities that I'm expected to be actively developing any given year, and I have to report out what I've done in my annual review process. And then my supervisor sits down with me and goes through and says, looks like you did a lot of this. I think over this next year, you should be doing more of that. And so all we're, I think, suggesting here is that DEI work should be part of that conversation. And it's often not in organizations. And that's the downside here, is we often have people who are doing this as their second job, and they're not getting, it's not being seen. They're not getting rewarded for it, and they're getting burnt out for it. Because they're doing this on top of other stuff. And if we actually looked at DEI work as a capability, as a set of core competencies, just like all the other things that we do, then we'd be able to effectively balance workflow. And to the concern around the emotional labor, that is different about people-focused work, whether it's DEI work or whether you work in HR. If you're working with people, you are, and even as a leader, I mean, right? Think about how we were trying to lead during the pandemic. It was hard, right? There are lots of situations that end up touching us as human beings, and it's just, you're just trying to do your best to support people. But understanding that when we're having these types of roles that are really intense from a people management perspective, we do need to have the calibration of those activities against the other activities that we're engaging in. So I would say, in summary, the walk away here is treat it like it's any other work activity that we have to engage in order for our teams to perform well and for our organizations to perform even better.
Well, and that takes me to the E of your merit process: elevate DEI work internally and externally, make it visible. I love that idea of, for every person who's engaged in this type of work, to put it on their performance review, put it on their development goals, make it part of, explaining what you've accomplished throughout the quarter, throughout the year, in your ongoing conversations. I think that's a great way to go. And then there was another question, which is, what size of organization should care about this? And maybe, Dr. Creary, you could sort of talk about, does this only matter at a certain level of company? Does it matter at all level of companies? Where, sort of, when should a company think about doing this?
Yeah, so if we think about DEI work, and in this report, we talk about 7 different kinds of internal talent-focused DEI work activities. I'm not going to remember all 7 off the top of my head, but like one of them is like mentoring and sponsoring initiatives, right? Another one is DEI training. Another one is diversity recruiting. Some others are workplace policies, right? So you'll see that there are 7 categories. And I think about, one of my students asked me this the other day, because, as you can imagine, so many students these days want to create a startup, right? Because it sounds, really attractive. It sounds, I think it looks easy. They don't know it's not that easy, but they think about startups all the time. And so they say to me, Professor, you're saying all these strategies, but I'm thinking about like big organizations like IBM and Google. Like, should my 4-person startup even care about diversity? And I said, okay, well, let's go back to understanding that there are many things that companies are trying to accomplish through diversity. One thing that many companies are trying to create through diversity is better decision-making, right? More effective decision-making, more creative products and services, more innovation broadly. I would think your 4-person team cares about that, right? So while diversity recruiting might seem a little bit far as from your, how do we think about a 4-person diverse team? Either way, it looks like we're just going to have one of everything. Step away from that for a minute and focus on this idea of, you want that 4-person team to perform well, just like you have a 4-person team in a large organization. The idea behind diversity, equity, inclusion based on research is that teams that have a variety of perspectives represented and can effectively activate that diversity in a way that helps people to learn different ways of engaging in the work, those teams are more likely to implement the best idea, the one that's the highest, the one that's going to lead to the best growth opportunity and the greatest performance, right? So that's the science behind this. And so then what needs to be done in order to get your team to do that? You need diverse perspectives represented on your team, right? So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a 5-person team or a 300,000 person organization. I have students who are doing team projects right now, and I had to remind them about diverse, effective teams, because this is the time of year where everyone's stressed and nobody wants to listen to anybody. And I have to remind them that, your 4-person team does need to perform effectively. So I hope that helps you to understand that there's a case for DEI, whether we're talking about the team level, which is what most of the research is based on, or whether we're talking about a huge organization that's trying to do a lot.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I think it can sometimes be easier to build a DEI conscious organization from the ground up, and to have those values and those practices built in from the beginning. Early days, it may be a little more difficult, but it doesn't change the fact, as you said, that diverse teams, diverse companies outperform non-diverse teams and non-diverse companies, as long as you're conscious about, sort of including the diverse perspectives and really listening to each other and getting the best from that diverse team. and that diverse company. So we've got one last question, and then I'm going to turn it back to Myra to wrap us up here. But just want to ask you personally, how did you get into this work, and sort of how do you keep positive and moving forward, perhaps when sort of the data doesn't show we're moving as fast as we would want to be?
Yeah, so this is where I will confess that for many people, particularly in my field of organizational behavior, research is me search. So what often drives our research questions is some set of personal experiences that we've had that have made this a very salient issue for us, and we couldn't find the answers easily. So I think for me, I'm a Black African-American woman. And when I went to college in the 90s, I chose an institution that had said, come here, we're diverse, we're going to learn from one another. And that is not what happened when I got to that university. As a matter of fact, there were like all these collections of people who were in their own groups, and nobody ever really exchanged ideas. We weren't learning from the diversity. And so that was in the 90s. And then I started getting involved at my university, just as a student who was studying something else, trying to whatever I could do to help convince my supervisors and my professors and my administration that it wasn't enough to just have all of us come to this university. More needed to be done. And so now if I said that this was the 90s, you now know how many years later this was. This is now. And so in 2006 or 7 is when I really decided, actually I had a professor who said to me, I think you'd make a great business school professor. And I didn't know what that meant or what that looked like. And her research was focused on diversity in organizations. And so that's when I understood that this was an area of academic scholarship and not just, a nice to have practice. There's a science, lots of sciences behind it. There's psychology and sociology, there's economics, there's legal studies. And I just, then 15 years ago committed to doing this work. And again, it was born out of the things that I saw were going wrong in the institutions I've been part of. That was just my educational institution. I did work before I got my PhD. And I just see organizations always wrestling with this issue. So I say what my goal here is, it really is to help companies understand that there is a way, a very concrete way to move from the abstract of this is something that's important to actually people experiencing that we're actually benefiting from all this commitment of resources, time, energy, and emotions that we're putting into this work.
That's fantastic. And I couldn't agree more that the work is highly needed, and having the research and the data to back it up is incredibly important. So thank you, Stephanie, Dr. Creary, for your insights. I look forward to implementing the practices that you speak of. And now, Myra, I'm going to turn it back to you to wrap us up.
Thank you so much. What an awesome conversation. Is anybody else hearing feedback, or is that just me? Sorry. I'm sorry if there's an echo. I'm not sure where that's coming from. But in any case, on behalf of Betterworks and our presenters, we'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. A reminder, please take our feedback survey. It's the last icon on the back. And please join us for our next webinar on January 27th, Making the Most of a Pivotal Moment. We'll be joined by John Doerr, venture capitalist and chairman of Connor Perkins, and Betterworks CEO Doug Dennerman for a discussion on the global climate crisis, what you as business and HR leaders can do right now to help make change. Click the megaphone icon in the doc to register. We hope to see you here. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.